which adorned each story of Mrs. Black's house. Mrs. Manstey saw she had been deceived. At first she thought of confiding her trouble to Mrs. Sampson, but a settled discouragement soon took possession of her, and she went back to bed, not caring to see what was going on. Toward afternoon, however, feeling that she must know the worst, she rose and dressed herself. It was a laborious task, for her hands were stiffer than usual, and the hooks and buttons seemed to evade her. When she seated herself in the window, she saw that the workmen had removed the upper part of the balcony, and that the bricks had multiplied since morning. One of the men, a coarse fellow with a bloated face, picked a magnolia blossom, and after smelling it, threw it to the ground. The next man, carrying a load of bricks, trod on the flower in passing. "Look out, Jim," called one of the men to another who was smoking a pipe. "If you throw matches around near those barrels of paper, you'll have the old tinder-box burning down before you know it." And Mrs. Manstey, leaning forward, perceived that there were several barrels of paper and rubbish under the wooden balcony. At length the work ceased and twilight fell. The sunset was perfect, and a roseate light, transfiguring the distant spire, lingered late in the west. When it grew dark, Mrs. Manstey drew down the shades and proceeded in her usual methodical manner to light her lamp. She always filled and lit it with her own hands, keeping a kettle of kerosene on a zinc-covered shelf in a closet. As the lamplight filled the room, it assumed its usual peaceful aspect. The books and pictures and plants seemed, like their mistress, to settle themselves down for another quiet evening. And Mrs. Manstey, as was her wont, drew up her armchair to the table and began to knit. That night she could not sleep. The weather had changed, and a wild wind was abroad, blotting the stars with close-driven clouds. Mrs. Manstey rose once or twice and looked out of the window, but of the view nothing was discernible save a tardy light or two in the opposite windows. These lights at last went out, and Mrs. Manstey, who had watched for their extinction, began to dress herself. She was in evident haste, for she merely flung a thin dressing-gown over her nightdress and wrapped her head in a scarf. Then she opened her closet and cautiously took out the kettle of kerosene. Having slipped a bundle of wooden matches into her pocket, she proceeded, with increasing precautions, to unlock her door, and a few moments later she was feeling her way down the dark staircase, led by a glimmer of gas from the lower hall. At length she reached the bottom of the stairs, and began the more difficult descent into the utter darkness of the basement. Here, however, she could move more freely, as there was less danger of being overheard, and without much delay she contrived to unlock the iron door leading into the yard. A gust of cold wind smote her as she stepped out and groped shiveringly under the clotheslines. That morning, at 3 o'clock, an alarm of fire brought the engines to Mrs. Black's door, and also brought Mrs. Sampson's startled boarders to their windows. The wooden balcony at the back of Mrs. Black's house was ablaze, and among those who watched the progress of the flames was Mrs. Manstey, leaning in her thin dressing-gown from the open window. The fire, however, was soon put out, and the frightened occupants of the house, who had fled in scant attire, reassembled at dawn to find that little mischief had been done beyond the cracking of window-panes and smoking of ceilings. In fact, the chief sufferer by the fire was Mrs. Manstey, who was found in the morning gasping with pneumonia, a not unnatural result, as everyone remarked, of her having hung out of an open window at her age in a dressing-gown. It was easy to see that she was very ill, but no one had guessed how grave the doctor's verdict would be, and the faces gathered that evening about Mrs. Sampson's table were awestruck and disturbed. Not that any of the boarders knew Mrs. Manstey well. She kept to herself, as they said, and seemed to fancy herself too good for them. But then it is always disagreeable to have anyone dying in the house, and as one lady observed to another, "It might just as well have been you or me, my dear." But it was only Mrs. Manstey, and she was dying, as she lived, lonely if not alone. The doctor had sent a trained nurse, and Mrs. Sampson, with muffled step, came in from time to time. But both to Mrs. Manstey seemed remote and unsubstantial as the figures in a dream. All day she said nothing, but when she was asked for her daughter's address she shook her head. At times the nurse noticed that she seemed to be listening attentively for some sound which did not come. Then again she dozed. The next morning at daylight she was very low. The nurse called Mrs. Sampson, and as the two bent over the old woman, they saw her lips move. "Lift me up out of bed," she whispered. They raised her in their arms, and with her stiff hand she pointed to the window. "Oh, the window! She wants to sit in the window. She used to sit there all day," Mrs. Sampson explained. "It can do her no harm, I suppose." "Nothing matters now," said the nurse. They carried Mrs. Manstey to the window and placed her in her chair. The dawn was abroad, a jubilant spring dawn. The spire had already caught a golden ray, though the magnolia and horse-chestnuts still slumbered in shadow. In Mrs. Black's yard all was quiet. The charred timbers of the balcony lay where they had fallen. It was evident that since the fire the builders had not returned to their work. The magnolia had unfolded a few more sculptural flowers. The view was undisturbed. It was hard for Mrs. Manstey to breathe. Each moment it grew more difficult. She tried to make them open the window, but they would not understand. If she could have tasted the air, sweet with the penetrating ailanthus savor, it would have eased her. But the view at least was there. The spire was golden now, the heavens had warmed from pearl to blue. Day was alight from east to west. Even the magnolia had caught the sun. Mrs. Manstey's head fell back, and smiling, she died. That day the building of the extension was resumed. The end. Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. Recording by Rena Toby.